Hi everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Monday, the 1st of February. And where we are is talking a little bit about Shakespeare's biography and getting ready to start talking about Shakespeare's text. We are going to begin with Shakespeare's sonnets, and we'll spend a couple of classes, approximately a week or so, talking about that, and then we will move forward and we will begin talking about his first major play that we'll be studying over the course of this semester, which happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. Where I left you off last class was watching a documentary that talked a little bit about Shakespearean biography and also talked a little bit about the authorship question. And as you can see from that documentary, there are lots of speculations about who Shakespeare was and whether or not he was the author of the plays. And in fact, that was the attendance question that I had asked you to consider, whether or not you thought Shakespeare was responsible for his plays. So I suspect you're probably curious about my own feelings about that. And now I'm willing to reveal that I believe Shakespeare did indeed write his plays. That said, there isn't any reason why he couldn't have had some collaboration. That is something that was not only common during the Renaissance, but is also common in today's world. I think about my own students who might get some assistance in the Learning Center or from friends and family. And that is a kind of collaboration if you want to think about it. That said, I think there's a difference between getting assistance or feedback or editorial comments on a work and then actually writing the work itself. And I know that many of the arguments about Shakespeare happen to deal with the fact that, first of all, he didn't attend university. But as I've oftentimes argued, genius cannot be taught in an academic setting. So while it is indeed true that he doesn't necessarily have a formal education, I don't think that in any way negates the possibility that he could have written these plays. And if we think about the great geniuses of our past, I think we can see that, again, it wasn't so much their schooling, but just natural ability that led them to be able to do what they did. The second that oftentimes is discussed is about the fact that there are multiple spellings for things like Shakespeare's signature. However, at the time, spelling was not standardized, not even for names, so it would not have been that unusual. The third is the lack of documentation about Shakespeare's life. And certainly there is more documentation about other individuals, but that said, I don't think that that's enough to illustrate that Shakespeare was not the author of his particular works. The video was obviously biased towards Christopher Marlowe, and in fact, Marlowe is the person that I focused on in my own graduate studies. I ended up doing my master's thesis on Dr. Faustus, and certainly I do see similarities between Marlowe's and Shakespeare's writing. That said, I think that there is a certain level of superiority to Shakespeare, if for no other reason, just the wealth of material that we have because of Shakespeare. Whether or not Marlowe could have achieved that status if he had lived, we'll never know for certain. Lots of other theories out there, right down to Queen Elizabeth, that because of her royal stature and because of her gender, being a female, she couldn't take credit for these works. Or perhaps it was somebody from the royal court, or perhaps it was even a committee. And I like to joke about this, and I think I mentioned this in one of the attendance questions, at least in terms of the committees that I've served on. We can't even find the time to meet, let alone find time to write over 30 plays and keep it a secret. So, of course, we don't know definitively, and that's really the whole point of what I wanted you to walk away with, as well as the few pieces of information that we do have about Shakespeare, based mostly on legal records. Things like birth certificates and death certificates and things of that nature. We can piece together a few elements about Shakespeare. But in terms of knowing much about his life, we obviously don't, and perhaps it doesn't much matter, because in the end, we have the plays themselves. Which, as we will discuss, that's not to say that the plays don't come with their own mysteries, because they do. And that's part of what I wanted to talk about today. And you'll see that I don't have a reading schedule for today because I wanted to fill in a few areas about Shakespeare before we move forward to the readings themselves. And the first I wanted to talk about would be the theaters. And certainly the Globe Theater is probably the most famous theater that has ever existed on the planet. But the purpose of the Globe was not just for entertainment, but for intellectual stimulation. It was the television of the day, if you will, and all levels of society attended the theater. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, the noble and the laborer, everything in between. So, in other words, Shakespeare had to write on multiple levels to appeal to all of these different levels of audience, which is one of the reasons why he's such a popular playwright. And including the individuals who would be considered groundlings or stinkers. And the reason why they would be known as groundlings is because they couldn't afford to pay for a seat in the theater itself, which was this circular round theater with covered seats mostly. And of course, if you were able to afford a covered seat, then you were of a particular class. And in fact, if you were of an even higher class, you could perhaps afford something like a cushion for that hard wooden seat so that you could have a bit more comfort. But if you couldn't afford a seat that was covered, you would be standing on the ground in front of the theater that jutted out. And you would be known as a groundling. And the irony of that is, while you might have been very uncomfortable because you were exposed to the elements and you couldn't sit down, you might have the best view in the house. And I compare it to something like going to a concert, a rock concert, for instance, where in the end, most people end up standing anyway so that they can see what's happening. And obviously, the closer you are to the stage, the more likely it is that you're going to have a better view of what's going on, especially because they didn't have cameras during the time period. The reason why these individuals were also known as stinkers is because they were exactly that. They stank. The Renaissance was not known for its hygiene. The way the story goes is that Queen Elizabeth, the monarch at the time, took one bath yearly, whether she needed it or not. And if you think about these theaters, we oftentimes have this conception of a very sophisticated venue, and that wouldn't have been the case at all. That it would be much like a sports stadium, and the theaters were known as somewhat seedy areas with pickpockets and with prostitutes. They didn't have bathroom facilities. There was a good amount of drinking going on, ale, because the water was unsafe to drink because people were basically throwing their waste into the Thames River. So you put all of those things together, and obviously you can get a sense of a situation that would not necessarily be much like an opera house that we might perhaps consider a Shakespearean drama performed in. But luckily for us, Queen Elizabeth loved the theater and she was a patron of the arts. So even though the arts came with the somewhat unsavory sort of reputation, her support is one of the reasons why these plays and the history of art in general in the Renaissance has existed and continues to exist so that we can view that. All of this begins with medieval theater in terms of the British tradition of theater, though certainly theater goes all the way back to Greek and Roman times. If you want to think about something like Oedipus the King, that would have been done in Greek society in an amphitheater in 430 BC. But in terms of medieval theater in England, these were traveling wagons that would go from community to community, and basically the actors would travel to the audiences, and they would enact biblical stories, but they would put a certain level of creativity into them. And it's not necessarily the most efficient way to go about running a business. Certainly, they realized that having a stationary theater and having the audience come to them was much more cost effective. And that's what led to the construction of these open air circular theaters. Again, the Globe, probably the most famous. And they were known for having thatched roofs and plaster walls, and again, somewhat seedy places. The Globe, the first Globe, because there's more than one, the first Globe was destroyed by a fire. And the way the story goes is that a cannon was used for some stage effects, and the wadding of the cannon actually set the thatched roof on fire. And according to the stories, no one died, but one man's pants caught on fire and they needed to be put out by ale. So the Globe was reconstructed, this time with a tile roof. And if anybody has ever lived in fire country, such as California, you know that tile roofs are important. And then after Shakespeare's death, the Puritans, who were a very strict religious sect, who basically believed that things like theater were sinful, they destroyed the theater. They basically tore it down. And then it wasn't really until 1990s, that long, that actually was an American actor who was visiting Britain. His name is Sam Wanamaker. Was quite astonished to see there was no theater there, just a small placard. And he made it his lifelong mission, basically, to reconstruct the Globe Theater, even though he had no money and he also didn't have British pedigree. And lo and behold, he was successful. Unfortunately, he was not able to live long enough to see the reconstructed Globe Theater, but it now exists very close to the spot where the original Globe Theater was. And it is a venue for performances, or I should say, it was a venue for performances before the virus, to try to reconstruct to the best of their ability what an audience might have experienced. And in fact, I think I had indicated in my previous class that one of the things I wanted us to do would be to talk about performance. And one of our first plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream, I have a performance that was actually done in that reconstructed Globe Theater that I wanted us to watch so that we could get a sense of what it might have been like to experience that play in the theater, because the theater ultimately influences many of the theatrical conventions and the writing that occurs. So in terms of our thinking about the theaters, they would have things like trapdoors, which would mean that a character could disappear, or perhaps a character could go into the depths of hell. They would have overhead stage machinery, which means that a character could be lifted up into heaven, let's say, for instance, or a god could be lifted down onto the stage. There would be special effects such as cannons that I mentioned and fireworks. In fact, a great piece of folklore about a performance of Dr. Faustus that supposedly during its first performance, the actors refused to finish the play. It was at the part of the performance where they were supposed to conjure up a demon, and there were all kinds of fireworks that went off to illustrate that. According to the actors, what they saw through the smoke was a real demon, that they had successfully conjured a demon, and they ran off stage and they refused to perform. Do what you will with that particular story, but I suspect that ticket sales were rather brisk the next day. So it might have been a very smart business move to create that particular story, even though public relations may not necessarily, and advertising may not have existed at that time in the way it does today. I think it was quite clever. Unless, of course, they actually conjured a demon, and then that's a whole other story. As you know, I tend to be interested in media and popular culture and Gothic literature and also in horror film. So I guess we could talk about demons in one of those classes if you were interested. But nevertheless, the performances usually occurred in the afternoon just so that you could take advantage of the natural light. Keep in mind that they wouldn't have had all of the electronic luxuries that we take for granted today. And in fact, the theaters were viewed as such seedy sort of venues that they weren't allowed to advertise properly. Therefore, the top of the theater would have a flag that they would put out, much like businesses today, for instance, would put out a flag to denote that they're open. And in fact, the color of the flag that would be flying over the Globe Theater would indicate the genre, the kind of play that would be performed. So black would be a tragedy, and white would be a comedy, and red would be a history play, for instance. And we'll talk a little bit about these genres in the next few minutes. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the texts themselves. And there were basically these unauthorized versions that I guess could best be compared to a paperback book, and they are known as the quartos. So it would be possible for audience members at the time, even though these plays were not copyrighted, to get versions of the play. Either you could hire someone to sit in the audience and transcribe everything that occurred, and you can imagine the number of errors that would occur. Or you could hire one of the actors, usually one of the bit actors, to try to reconstruct the play. And again, the bit actor probably knew his particular role well, and I do say his because, as you saw in the documentary, but I suspect many of you already knew this, women were not allowed to act in plays, therefore young adolescent boys played the roles of females. But at any rate, you could hire an actor, perhaps a bit actor, to reconstruct, and there were probably lots of errors. I think of this almost like buying a bootleg CD or a DVD, if you will. And you could get one of those quartos, and this is a printer's term, meaning that you fold a large sheet of paper into fourths, or cuatro, if you know Spanish. So if you've got a sheet of paper like this, what you would basically do is fold it once, but then folded again. So it would look something like a small paperback book with 4 leaves or 4 sheets of paper. But it wasn't until 7 years after Shakespeare's death when his contemporaries got together and they tried to put together a definitive version of his works. This had never been done before, and is usually one of the pieces of evidence that's used to show that Shakespeare was indeed Shakespeare, in that if he wasn't Shakespeare, his contemporaries would not have come together to try to preserve his works in the way that they did and give him the credit for those particular works. This was known as the folio, and again, it's a printer's term where you take a large sheet of paper, but this time you fold it just once. So it's like this. And what editors do is that they look at the folio, and in fact, there's several versions of the folio because there were some edits that were made afterwards, as well as all of the versions of the quarto that might exist for a particular play. And all of these are going to be different from one another. And editors have basically spent a lifetime learning about Shakespeare and his language and the theater, so they can try to reconstruct to the best of their ability what the actual play would have been. And most plays, there's very little discrepancy or dispute about what was written. And those are the ones we usually read in college. However, there are plays known as problem plays because they are exactly that. They are problems because there are huge differences between the two. And in fact, going back to Christopher Marlowe again, there are actually 2 versions of his most famous play, Dr. Faustus, version A and version B. They're radically different from one another. One is much shorter than another. The shorter version doesn't have the comedic elements associated with it. And scholars bicker back and forth as to which one might be the most appropriate play. The B version is the correct length for a play. However, that said, it's got comedic elements within it, though it wouldn't have been that unusual, I don't think. At least this was my conclusion from my graduate studies. It wouldn't have been that unusual to embed comedic elements in a tragedy, so I believe that Dr. Faustus, the B version, is probably more accurate to the A version, which is shorter, so it really wouldn't be the standard length of a play. But it certainly is much more serious and perhaps more what you are thinking about in terms of a tragedy, which we'll define in a few moments, actually. So at any rate, in addition to all of the plays that Shakespeare would have written and the editors who have gone through and have tried to make the best decisions that they could about his plays, and what you will see is that occasionally, if you're reading a version of Shakespeare, there could be a footnote at the bottom with a question mark. And the footnotes basically define language in the way it would have been used during the Renaissance. So having a text with good footnotes is not a bad idea. Something like the Riverside Shakespeare, which I had suggested as an option for our class, but certainly not a requirement. You can use any version you wanted. If there is a comma, or I'm sorry, if there is a question mark at the ending of a footnote, that's the editor's best guess as to what that word might have meant, because there were no standard dictionaries at the time, and actually Shakespeare created for quite a few words. Some have been incorporated into our language and still exist today. Some have never been used since Shakespeare's plays. Occasionally within the play itself, what you might see is a question mark embedded in square brackets. Now, square brackets, as you may remember, is a grammatical convention in order to illustrate when you, as a writer, are inserting something into a quotation. You are putting your own language into a quote, so that was not part of the original quote. So if you see question mark in square brackets, that means that this is the editor's insertion of they're illustrating that they're not quite sure what word would be there. It happens rarely, especially with the plays that we would be reading in class, but even in the Riverside, you'll see that occasionally. So the plays themselves have perhaps as many questions as Shakespeare, the author, does. In fact, we're not even necessarily sure of the order in which they were written and the years and dates in which they were written. But generally, what most scholars agree with is that the comedies were, for the most part, written during the earlier part of Shakespeare's career. They aren't necessarily as sophisticated and developed as some of the other plays. The histories would have been written in the next part of Shakespeare's career. Then the tragedies at the height of Shakespeare's career. And then finally, the tragic comedies. And we will be reading representative samples of all of these. The comedies are indeed comedic, but they also focus on love and all of the misunderstandings that can occur with love. If you want to think about something like a modern-day romantic comedy, it's probably more similar to that. And they do end happily, which meant marriage or the promise of marriage. I'll let you decide whether or not that's a happy ending. And there would be lots of music and dance and celebration. This is how we're going to begin the semester, by reading A Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing. Both of them are considered comedies. The histories were that British history. It was a way for Britons to show their patriotism for their country and also to learn about their past. But the history was fictionalized in order to serve Shakespeare's dramatic purposes. So if you're a real history buff, you could get very frustrated with watching the history plays because they don't exactly follow British history. Shakespeare would have taken whatever dramatic liberties he thought were necessary in order to tell a good story. So if you've ever watched a movie that says based on real events, perhaps you understand that. The history plays are notoriously complex because they have lots and lots of characters. They're about politics and intrigue. And that said, even though the politics might be a different system than the system we have in the United States, in fact, the United States exists because we were trying to get away from the British system, I think you'll see that there are a good number of modern day parallels. So when we get to the history plays, I oftentimes ask you to think about not Britain, but Washington, D.C. And I think all of a sudden the play will make a lot more sense to you. The tragedies are just that. They are tragic. They're based on the idea of tragedy established with Oedipus the King, the first perhaps tragic play ever written, or certainly considered to be the greatest tragic play ever written in 430 BC, where you have a great man above and beyond the ordinary experiencing descent, and basically they have to acknowledge that they're somewhat responsible for that descent. They have some responsibility, their flaws in character. But there are also outside forces at play, oftentimes things like luck or fate that they have no control over. And then they accept a certain level of responsibility. That's the general definition of a tragedy, which Shakespeare would have altered in order to suit his dramatic purposes. Again, not because he didn't know what a tragedy was, but oftentimes he felt that he would have a better story if he didn't necessarily follow all of the conventions of what a tragedy was. If you think about the tragedies, you can just think about the titles, how they're oftentimes named after one single individual. Macbeth, King Lear, Othello. So the titles themselves are much different from things like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. And then finally, we get to the tragic comedies, which we think were written towards the ending of Shakespeare's career, where he was mixing genres. A lot of the darkness of tragedies, but a lot of the music and dance of comedies, and the happy ending. In other words, no death, that you would find in a comedy. There will be death, and quite a few of it in the tragedies, and even in the histories as well. Now, the theaters would be sometimes closed for plague. And at the time, individuals would have to basically quarantine, much like we're doing now. And we think that that's when Shakespeare ultimately wrote most of his sonnets. And these are short poems that can be read as individual units. They were not a sonnet cycle, which was the kind of more common sonnet at the time, where all of the sonnets would tell one big story. And that said, there are themes that run through Shakespeare's sonnets, and he wrote over 100 of them, but they can all be read as individual units. And as we will talk about when we get to the sonnets have oftentimes been read as a way to try to find out about Shakespeare's biography, but you won't get very far because they oftentimes are so general, or they oftentimes are so contradictory with one another that you really can't tell anything about Shakespeare himself, the man. That said, the sonnets probably written when the theaters were closed for plague, and what you oftentimes have in Shakespeare's writing is unrhymed iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line with unstressed and stressed syllables. The sonnets would be a little bit different in that they would have a particular rhyme scheme or pattern, and that would be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Each letter of the alphabet representing a new rhyme, which we'll talk about in greater depth when we talk about the sonnets next class. The sonnets also had to be 14 lines long, and they had to discuss lofty themes. So there are very strict rules on how to write these sonnets, but even though Shakespeare had to follow these strict rules, he illustrated lots of creativity within his writing. The plays would be in a 5-act pyramid structure, where Act 1 would basically be the introduction to the characters. Act 2 would be the beginning of tension. Act 3, The top of the pyramid would be the height of tension. Act 4 would be decreasing action, and Act 5 would be resolution. Midsummer Night's Dream is slightly different in terms of that 5-act structure, and we'll talk a little bit about how it is. But generally, that's how a Shakespearean play would be divided up. For a performance that could last anywhere between, let's say, 2 to 4 hours or so. Again, enough for an audience to feel like they were getting their money's worth. And they would usually, we speculate, be an intermission about halfway through that particular performance. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the plays that Shakespeare wrote and the sonnets that he wrote. He also wrote a couple of long poems that we aren't going to be talking about in an introductory Shakespeare class. And for our upcoming readings next week, we're beginning with the sonnets. Sonnets 15, 18, 20, sonnets 127, 130, and 151. The sonnets were not titled, so we refer to the sonnets by either their number, and scholars have put them into a particular order, or we refer to the sonnets by their first line. And I thought that these 6 would give us a general idea of what Shakespearean language was like, so we can begin practicing our skills, as well as show us some of the themes and issues that we will see developed in greater depth in the Shakespearean plays. And I have a whole week devoted to that. And then we move forward to our comedy. The first play we'll be reading, A Midsummer Night's Dream. As I had indicated, what I'm hopeful of is that, although we've got 2 weeks assigned approximately for each play, that at the very beginning of each unit for each play, you would have read the play in its entirety. So as we're talking about the play over several classes, you're reading the next play in the syllabus. But however, I understand that the world is hardly ideal, so that may not necessarily be possible for you. And we will also be watching performances as well as discussing the plays. And watching performances is in no way a substitute for the play. It's a supplement for it, but at least it'll give you an idea of what an audience might have experienced, because ultimately Shakespeare wrote his plays to be performed, not to be read. But the greatness about Shakespeare's writing is that you will see that when you read the plays, they are incredibly complex, as if they were written to be read. So you've got the performance piece, and you've also got the writing piece, both in terms of Shakespeare's plays. And as I had indicated, you can use whatever edition of Shakespeare you feel comfortable using. I've also included a website for you in the notes below from the Folger Shakespeare. Now, the Folger Shakespearean Library is in Washington, D.C. It's considered the premier Shakespeare library in the United States, and they have all of Shakespeare's works online available for free, and I've included the link for that. And as the semester goes on, I might give you some other links, too, of other places where you can look for Shakespeare's works. But you can bet that the Folger Shakespeare is a very good resource, much like the Riverside is a very good resource. The Folger, I don't believe, gives you footnotes, but it does give you a brief summary at the beginning of each of the sonnets, and you'll see that the sonnets are included there, as well as the plays that we'll be reading, though you'll have access to all of Shakespeare's canon. Just like in the Riverside, you have access to all of Shakespeare's plays, even though we're only reading representative plays. And in terms of assignments, we are doing informal writing assignments called journals. And what I wanted you to do is to respond informally, about a page or so, for each of the major Shakespearean works we're going to be reading, starting with the sonnets and then moving forward into the dramas. And that I'm evaluating informally on a checkmark system. I'm not reading for grammar or mechanics, purely for content. And you can think of it as a kind of conversation on paper, where you can add thoughts, reflections, or even questions about what it was that you were reading. And the journals won't be due until after each unit has completed, which means we would have talked about it in class and watched a performance if that was appropriate for that particular reading. So if we take our first unit, which would be the sonnets, your first journal is not going to be due until the 10th of February on Wednesday. By that point, we will have put a conclusion to talking about the sonnets, and then we will move forward to Midsummer Night's Dream. So you're certainly free to use whatever it is that I discuss in my class videos and whatever it is that's discussed in our attendance forms, as well as your own thoughts and reflections as well. The sonnet journal is going to be perhaps a little bit different than the other journals, because the other journals are going to be devoted to plays in their entirety. And as you know, we're reading 6 different sonnets. And certainly if you wanted to respond to all 6 sonnets, you could for your journal, or you could elect to just focus on one sonnet and talk about it more in depth, or you can just choose a middle ground, maybe 2 or 3 sonnets. So there are lots of different ways you could proceed with the sonnet journal. It'll be up to you. Again, that won't be due until the 10th, so we have a little bit of time to talk about the sonnets and also to talk about journals as well, as we get a little bit closer to that. Your assignment at this point is to read all of those sonnets, 15, 18, 20, 127, 130, and 151, and to try to read as much as possible of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which we will be beginning not next week, but the week following. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of where we are as a class. Obviously, we'll have formal writing assignments as well, 2 formal papers, but that won't be due for a while. So we've got a little bit of time to talk about how to read the plays and interpret the plays and the sonnets before we start talking about writing a paper. And many people end up using their journals or some of the ideas in their journals for a paper. So that might be something that you can consider as well. So for today's attendance question for class, this would be due on Tuesday, the 2nd of February at 8 a.m. But if you need an extension, just let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. And my attendance question is, what do you think is the most interesting thing you've learned about Shakespeare thus far? What do you think is the most interesting thing you've learned about Shakespeare thus far? And of course, you can see that these are the kinds of questions that don't have right or wrong answers, and that's very deliberate. It's not necessarily about facts, but about understanding the interpretations and the depth and the complexity of Shakespeare. So these are the kinds of attendance questions that I like to ask that count as your attendance for that particular class. A question I might have asked in class if we were meeting in person. And then ultimately we could have a class discussion about it, though I would ask lots of other questions as well. And note that I've got an optional chat and an optional Zoom for this class if it turns out that you wanted to have dialogue with me or dialogue with your peers. And that's on Mondays and Wednesdays from 1 to 1:30. On Monday from 1 to 1:30 is the chat, and on Wednesdays from 1 to 1:30 is the Zoom. And certainly, it'll be based on what your needs and expectations are. So if several people end up showing up, we can have a kind of impromptu class if you'd like. If there's just 1 or 2, we can just have an informal conversation. If there's several of you who think you're interested in trying to have some sort of a class discussion, perhaps we can make arrangements to meet at the 1 o'clock for Zoom or at another time so that we can duplicate something like a class discussion. But again, that'll be dependent on your interests and your availability, so you just have to let me know. But again, every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, unless there's some sort of a meeting or something going on that I can't miss, I'll be there on Zoom. And every Monday at 1 o'clock, I'll be there in our chat room if you want to chat with me. And again, I invite all of you to attend, not that you have to. So there is a group of people so that we could bat around ideas. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we'll begin talking more in depth about Shakespeare's sonnets. Take care. Bye-bye.